Hereditary is a divisive film. People either love it or they hate it, and a lot of people who don't like the film have a variety of reasons, but one of the common reasons I see is this disappointment in a sense that the film undermines its own metaphor of being about mental illness and grief by making the supernatural elements so literal. I think this is in part due to how often analysis of this film, especially in video format, really focuses on the kind of spotting Easter eggs or hidden details of the cult activity right from the onset of the film. I think this gives a lot of people the impression that the cult activity and all of these hidden details are the subtext of the story rather than just the more subtle parts of the text. It's undeniable that mental illness and grief are key elements present in the film, but I don't think that makes them the focus. I think that they're subjects that are included to prop up the message of the film. In my opinion, the film is not about mental illness and grief. It's about generational trauma, the way that families pass that on, and more specifically, the way society helps prop up that cycle of trauma for its benefit. In other words, the film is about generational religious trauma. And in that reading, the cult is a necessary element because it's a depiction of spiritual and religious fanatics using mental illness and grief as tools to manipulate people for their end. Joan is a really good example of this, as she is obviously an important member of the cult, and she inserts herself into Annie's life via her shared grief and the horror of having lost a loved one, specifically children, to an awful accident. Joan explains that her son and grandson drowned, though we don't get any confirmation of this. It's just as likely that it's either trauma that she's using to manipulate Annie or didn't happen and she's using lies and deceit to manipulate Annie. Annie's grief about first her mother and then about her daughter are useful tools for Joan to pull on in order to get her to do things like introducing her to spiritual practices like the seance and specific chants that she has to say with the whole family in the house in order to eventually bring in her deity, King Payment. In fact, we explicitly know this to be the case because of the book on invoking that Annie finds in her mom's things that says, when successfully invoked, King Payment will possess the most vulnerable host. If you have seen a lot of those videos pointing out these hidden details in the film, you'll notice a lot of the people that show up later or are confirmed part of the cult members are also shown in the support group, at school, in random areas throughout town. It seems in almost all areas of life that this family touched throughout the town, there are cult members present, which implies that the entire town has somehow been kind of infiltrated or under the influence of this cult for a long time. In other words, the town itself seems embroiled and connected to these spiritual practices and invested in helping torture Annie and her family because they believe by taking these steps and actions, not only are they justified in doing so for their benefit, but that all of the members of the cult, including Annie, her mom, her daughter, her son, will all benefit as well. They'll all reap rewards, even though it involves torturing these people. And we learn throughout the film that Annie's mom, Ellen Lee, was a central figure of the cult. She's even propped up, and there's a picture of her at the end in the treehouse that calls her Queen Lee. But we never got to meet Ellen. We don't really know what she was like. We only know descriptions of her from Annie, who says that at the end of her life, she was severely mentally ill, both listing DID and dementia. Taken at face value, Ellen might even seem like a founder or leader of the cult, but I think in actuality, she too was a sacrificial lamb, where the cult preyed on her own mental illness and propped her up in this position of queen in order to manipulate her and bring forth the incarnation of their deity, King Payment. But why does the cult want to bring forth an incarnation of Payment in the first place? What's the end goal? Ultimately, it's to usher in a new world order under Payment of his incarnation in a male form. Payment's presence in the film even effectively being a mockerish depiction of the Trinity, with King Payment in hell as the father, the Holy Spirit of Payment being depicted as that blue light and lens flare that seemingly possesses figures like Charlie, Annie, and Peter, where Charlie would be the son of the Trinity, the imperfect incarnation, first in female form, later complete and perfected by being put in Peter, in a mirror of the kingdom of heaven that would be presumably installed by Jesus, as Christians profess. They are trying to install their own kingdom of hell under King Payment. At first glance, this seems like a straightforward depiction of, an inversion of Christian beliefs as satanic worship. But if we take the elements of the cult's teachings and beliefs and strip away the aesthetics and really think about it, right? They want to and are devoted to a figurehead that is a male incarnation of their deity that is ultimately set up for a patriarchal world order where the people who are involved believe suffering is necessary for the purposes of ushering in this new kingdom under their deity. This cult has infiltrated and embroiled itself in all parts of daily life within society, even the seemingly secular. It leverages grief, mental illness, people's own beliefs of their own brokenness in order to manipulate them to serve the overarching spiritual and religious practices of the cult. In other words, one reading of this film is not to say beware of satanic cults, but in other words, a mirroring of the ways Christianity is implicated in its perpetuation of cycles of trauma, and its preying on the vulnerable, and in professing vague rewards for, ushering in or accepting suffering as a necessary step. In other words, I think the film is using the aesthetics of satanic worship to actually criticize the way that, Christian religious dogma has infiltrated so much of society and perpetuates a lot of harm. And maybe it's not specifically about Christianity. I see a lot of parallels. Obviously, there's a lot of mockery of Christian imagery going on in this film, but I'm also biased, having been raised Catholic in the United States of America. I do think you can ultimately strip away the specifics of the religious or spiritual practices and get to a core tenet of the film, a core message that these religious practices and, the groups that prop up to support them do infiltrate a lot of the way we operate day to day in a way that allows easy access to targets for manipulation. Tell me if you think I'm onto something, or if there's another reading I haven't considered. Feel free to join me on my 31 Days of Horror movie marathon. The list of films is in my pinned videos.